Good morning. One day I'm going to get you all to sit closer. Just saying. No, you stay. You made your choices. Yeah, live with them. It is good to be back. I was gone last week and I missed all your faces. So it is wonderful to be back here this morning. And we are glad that you are here to worship with us. Just remember that you are holier than your friends who are staying home to watch the Seahawks game. Jesus knows and he loves you. No. I was gone for a conference, and when I was there, I recently happened to get lost in the woods. Well, not the woods, but the scrubby hill country trees that make up Texas. It was my first day at what is called the Credo Retreat. It's put on by the Presbyterian Church, the national body for pastors in their first 5 years to help combat burnout and act as a retention tool. And so I hauled myself on a plane to San Antonio and took a 2-hour car ride west into what felt like the middle of nowhere, because it was, in fact, the middle of nowhere. It's a little town called Hunt, Texas. And I was one of only 4 pastors who happened to get in the night before, and so we had gone early that morning and there was no one around. And since this was a conference dedicated to getting healthy holistically, I thought, I am going to start right now. I'm going to go for a run. And so I grabbed a rudimentary paper map and I headed off into the 500 acres of trail and nature. And at first it started off easy. There was a wide paved road that went up a hill, and it grew steeper and steeper gradually, but as it did, the map was still clearly marked. There were still familiar landscapes and buildings that pointed the way, that said, you are on the right path. But slowly, as I continued, it got hotter, and the further I went, the road gave way to a gravel path. And there were signs along the way that said, hiking trails this way, inspiration point, keep going. And before long, the trees and the bushes started to get thicker, and I couldn't see the camp any longer, and all buildings had disappeared. And still, though I persisted, I was going to get to inspiration point. I was going to have a moment with God. And I was going to find that point that the map had promised. And so I kept walking, one foot in front of the other. But the truth was, my unease was growing, because suddenly I realized I did not know where I was. My map had stopped being helpful about 30 minutes ago. I had not thought to bring water. And it was in the high 80s, and the humidity was over 70%. I hadn't even thought to put on sunscreen, which speaks to the Seattleite that I am. You see, the trails in the hill country of Texas, it turns out, can get incredibly confusing. With the rocky ground and the deer paths and the dry stream beds that make it hard to discern which is the right way to go. And I thought to myself, if something happens to me, no one is going to have any clue where I am. I am thousands of miles from home. My cell phone does not work in this God-forsaken state. I had not told anybody at the registration desk that I was even heading out onto the trails. And for all I knew, there were poisonous spiders or poisonous snakes or bears or mountain lions. It was not a smart life choice. And yet I still kept moving forward, even though I began to become highly tempted to turn back. I thought to myself, if I turn back now, at least I can kind of figure out the way. I know the way I came, and the higher and higher I got in the hills, and the further from the safety of camp I got, the stronger my fear grew. And right when I was about to admit defeat, to turn around, to try to relocate some familiar ground, there it was. Off in the distance, a tiny flutter of red. See, it's a trail tie. They're used to let people know that they are still on the right path. Keep going. And so I did, and lo and behold, around the next turn, there it was, even the next turn after that, a sign. A small piece of wood with an arrow on it. And then as I continued, there were more. You got the next picture. I was very excited. They were leading me on until I finally broke through all of the trees, and this is what I saw. Inspiration point. You see, but when I had been in the midst of all of those trees and in the midst of all of that fear, I could never have imagined just how far I had come, or that this is where I was trying to get. And I would spend much of the next 7 days in that hilly country getting lost and getting found over and over and over again. And it was on those walks that I began to think about the Israelites. I began to imagine how scary it was for them walking into that desert and out of Egypt, every step leaving it further behind. Every step going further and further from the known, every step leaving behind the safety of food and water and shelter. Trying to trust this God that they don't really know and they can't really see, and trying to follow this man Moses and his brother. And so I was not surprised when I looked at the text for this week and realized that we are about to come upon them months after they have been led from Egypt, and the Israelites are complaining. The passage today is long, so I invite you to sit and to listen and to follow along. This is Exodus 16. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you. And each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them whether they follow my instructions or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard your complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of Israelites, draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining." And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked towards the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as the frost on the ground. And when the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person, according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it as much as each needed, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. Now on the 6th day they gathered twice as much, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you bake, boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside until the morning." So they put it aside until the morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not become foul. There were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field." 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none. And yet on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, and they found none. The Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you food for 2 days. Each of you stay where you are. Do not leave your place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. This is the word of the Lord. The people were scared. 2.5 months in, and they were no closer to this elusive promised land, this elusive destination that Moses says he's taking them to. They were hungry. In fact, when you listen to them, you realize they were probably a little closer to hangry. The map had long ago lost any meaning, and their fear was pouring out. You brought us out here to die. At least back in Egypt, we had food. We are lost. We don't know where to go. We don't even know if we're on the right path. We don't know where we're going. And look, the way back might have been filled with tyranny and pain, but at least we understood it. And on our path of life and faith, how many of us have stood in this very place in the wilderness of sin? When after deciding to follow Jesus, we find ourselves no longer on the smooth and defined path, but all of a sudden things are rocky and unfamiliar and scary and long. Maybe we have faced infertility or divorce or betrayal or money challenges, the death of loved ones, the loss of faith, illness, chronic pain. We too shout at God, why have you brought us here to die? Let me go back. It might have been slavery, but at least I knew it. How can you keep asking me to follow you out here? Where are you? You see, the thing about those little trail ties is that they tell us that someone's been here before. That someone's come through and they have set the way, that even if we don't see them, there is one who has tread the path before us. And so in the midst of their complaints and their fear and their lack of trust, God hears his people. And like a tiny plastic tie, he gives to the Israelites their own sign that someone is there and has gone before them and is with them and is the sign of manna. But more even than the bread on the ground and the bread for their stomachs, he gives them something grander. They get their first glimpse of the glory of God. And this is the first time that it is mentioned in Scripture. And like an arrow on a sign, it points the Israelites onward. Keep going. Look, much has been made over the miracle of manna over the years. People want to try to figure it out. They want to know what it was. They want to know if it was natural or a miracle or could be reproduced. In fact, the very name, as we heard in Scripture, of manna has been transliterated for generations as, what is it? That's what manna means. What is it? But as we've done more research and we've begun to understand more about language, it's been pointed to that, in fact, rather than what is it, perhaps a better translation of the word manna is who is it? It's a small change, but it's critical because it tells us that what the people got in that moment is not a glimpse of what God provides, but who God is. The one who provides. The one who rescues and who sustains and is faithful to us. And it's why the rules of collection for this thing were so important, even if they seem ridiculous. The people are only supposed to gather just enough for what they need for that day. They're not supposed to hoard it or save it. Because God is calling his people to continue down their path of faith, to continue down their path of life, trusting that God would provide a signpost every day that they were on the right path. That even as they sat there on that seventh day, that they were being called to trust that God was there. You and I need signs in our life to point the way. But we also need to be able to trust the signs that God provides. We need to remember them. And that very first night when the manna comes, the Israelites fail to remember. They see the signpost, they hear the words of God, and they still try to choose their own path. They collect too much, and it goes bad. They didn't trust God. And as I wandered down those Texas paths, I too had these moments when I would see a sign that pointed one way. I don't know if you can see it. There's a tiny little sign on the far side of the screen that's pointing. You're supposed to go right, but it looks like you should go straight. So I went straight. This sign is ridiculous. I don't need to follow it. Clearly should go straight. And as I wandered, and occasionally did this more than once on paths that didn't even look that straight, and I knew it was dangerous, and I knew it was risky, and perhaps even dumb, but I wanted to forge my own path. You cannot tell me where to go. I am my own woman. And yet each time I would have to turn around defeated back to that sign and follow it. The Israelites, it turns out, are a lot like me. Because every time they're given a marker, they begin to get anxious about finding the next, and they're not sure if they really want to follow it when it seems like it's pointing the wrong direction. And so in chapter 17, they ask the same question again, because now they have food, but we want water. God, where is our water? And they ask, why did you bring us out here to die, to Moses? And in response, Moses goes to God and asks the eternal question of every pastor everywhere, what shall I do with these people? But the Lord remains patient. And he provides water from the stone and again creates another sign for the people and names the place Maasah and Meribah because it's the place where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and asked, is the Lord among us or not? And to this day, it becomes a place where the people know that the Lord is with us and has gone before us. Give us another sign. We are still lost. We cannot see. We all struggle with this because we don't trust the goodness of God, and we certainly don't trust God's GPS. And so onward, the people of God continue their journey, and they're trying to find their own inspiration point day after day, following the signs of the glory of God until all of a sudden, there it is. They've arrived at Mount Sinai. So they couldn't have had any idea that this is the place they were looking for until they stood before it. And that is so much our life that we often don't know where we're actually going until we stand before it. It's part of the nature of being human. We can't see where we're going. But God asks us to trust, to follow the signposts of our faith that have been left for us by generations previous and by God himself. That promise that we are not alone and that we are on the right path, even when it doesn't feel that way. It's at this mountain that they'll receive the covenant promise of God's favor and protection. Well, they'll begin their new journey as the chosen people of God, and they'll receive more signposts to guide their own lives and their community. Now, we've all seen the 10 Commandments, I'm guessing. If not, come talk to me. You might have seen Charlton Heston. He does a great Moses. Maybe you've seen them in a news story in front of a courthouse, or maybe you've read your Bible somewhere at some point. And they're intriguing to us. They capture our attention, but we fail to ask, why did God give them to the people in this particular place and time? Why now, when they're about to become this new community? Why not back in Egypt before they ever left? Or why not once they enter the promised land? What is happening in this moment that makes this the time and place for it? Instead, we often get caught up in the 10 Commandments of asking all sorts of qualifying questions to figure out if we actually can skirt around them. And that's okay. That's normal. But asking the how is so much more important. Asking the why is so much more important than the how. So the Lord reminds the people before he gives them the commandments of this. He says, look, I am the Lord your God who rescued you from slavery in Egypt. Remember me and remember my faithfulness. In this moment, this fulcrum point between who they were and who they're about to be, God is laying out one of the biggest signposts he can to say, this is the way. This is the path for you to follow. I have not led you astray yet. Trust me. And so in those moments, he brings forth these 10 laws, or really these 10 signposts for the people to follow. And I have figured out in my life that they can be broken down into 3 categories. The first category contains the first 3 commandments, which is, you must have no other gods before me, don't make an idol for yourself, and do not use the Lord your God's name as if it were no significance. This is what the first 3 basically come down to. Do not be a jerk to God. This is the God who saves you. This is the God who sustains you. It's the God who is deserving of your worship and your honor. And when you start there on your path, your way will be well marked. In the positive sense, God tells his people this later in Israel's story in Deuteronomy when he says, one of the most famous passages, right? Hear, O hear, Israel. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. Keep these words that I'm commanding to you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you're home and when you are away and when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your houses and your gates. You see, with these 3 first laws, they are markers of faith that allow us to navigate everything else. They are the fundamental, hard heart signs of a healthy faith community, of a healthy person, that say we are on the right path. And when people look at these, it helps guide them. If you remember for a minute Daniel, when he is in Babylon and he has everything laid out before him, he has power, he has money, all he has to do is bow before an idol. He has 2 paths that are laid before him, and he knows which one to take because the markers of God are clear. The next section that we can look at is the 4th commandment, which is this: remember the Sabbath day. Treat it as holy. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but the 7th is a Sabbath to you, to the Lord your God. Do not do any work on it, not you, your sons, your daughters, your male or female servants, your animals, or the immigrant who is living with you, because the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything that is in them in 6 days, but on the 7th he rested. In Pastor Brenna language, this is translated as do not be a jerk to yourself. Look, you need to rest. You need balance. You need peace and freedom and time with family, but most of all, you need time to be rather than do. To be God's child. To recognize what God has done. And when we're feeling lost and afraid, the Sabbath serves as a signpost for us, a marker of where we are on our faith and our life journeys. It tells us if we are healthy and balanced and on God's path, or if we've bought into the world's idea that every day is meant to use us up to the fullest extent, that we have to hoard and keep and get everything for ourselves because God won't provide. See, Jesus will later tell us to love our neighbors as ourselves, but friends, if we don't love ourselves, we cannot love our neighbors. And finally, the last 6. Honor your mother and father. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not testify falsely against your neighbor. Do not desire and try to take what is your neighbor's. Basically, don't be a jerk to other people. The community of faith is known and will be known for how it treats one another and how it treats strangers. So when we get lost in our sin and our fear and our darkness, these are the laws that point us back to the goodness and godliness, that point us back to Mount Sinai and the holy presence of God. If we wake up and find ourselves in a world where we are killing others, whether through actions or even through our words, where we covet what others own, where we commit infidelity in person or online, emotionally or physically, where we take from others in unethical ways, friends, we are off the path of faith. But we know how to look then for God's markers and where to go back to. And you will find that on that narrow path to God and the promised land, you will find those markers every place where kindness and mercy and generosity and Sabbath are seen. It is so easy to feel lost on this path of life. To look up and suddenly find ourselves in unfamiliar land. To wake up and find ourselves lost in depression or addiction or greed or anger or complacency or self-righteousness, to be lost in sorrow or busyness or business or power. You name it, we have managed to get ourselves there or to find out that we have been misled there by the world. And then we have to remember that we are not alone. That the markers of our faith tell us that there is one who has gone before us and is with us now. And that they are everywhere if we just remember what to look for. And so when fear and anxiety set in, when you want to scream out to God, did you only bring me to this place so you could kill me? Remember to pause and look around. Make yourself attentive, and you might just see off in the distance that fluttering little tie, the glory of God shadowed and hidden by clouds, and yet still there, promising that if we follow him, we will not be on this journey alone, and he will show us the way that leads to life. Friends, will you pray with me?